Okay, good morning from New York and welcome to Bubble Webinar's Getting Started API Workflows. My name is Nirja and I'm a technical account manager at Bubble. I'm excited to walk you through the platform and show you how to use API workflows while building your app. So thank you for joining me today. Before we get started, let's discuss what are API workflows. API workflows can be used to schedule workflows in your application in the future on a recurring basis or triggered from an external service. Today, we'll be diving into the fundamentals of building and scheduling API workflows in your app. This webinar will be recorded, and we will email you a link after the session so you can always rewatch at your convenience. For the method of this webinar, I'm going to be switching between a meeting roadmap so we can keep track of our progress and a test app we'll build together in Bubble. The roadmap will have some text for your future reference, but don't worry about catching it all, as most of our focus will be on the test app. We'll also have a Q&A open where you can ask questions. We will leave some time at the end to cover top questions. So with that, let's begin. The topics we'll cover today include when to use API workflows, API workflow properties, scheduling events in the future, automating recurring events, and allowing external services to trigger events in your app with webhooks and native apps. Some users are reporting audio issues. Can the rest of you hear me? The issue might just be your latest version of Chrome, so please try updating if you're running into further issues. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the top use cases of API workflows, because those of you who have attended our first two webinars are familiar with creating new thing and making changes to a thing in the database. And those are great options, but doing those actions directly will execute those actions immediately while running them through API workflows, allow you to schedule them in the future. Since API workflows can be run in the future and server-side, they allow your app to dynamically react to events from the external world. An additional benefit of API workflows is that the action that you want to run server-side can be run in the backend while the user continues to do something different on the client and the browser. So this can seem like a lot initially, but I'm going to walk you through an actual example in an app that should make this much more clear. And while you're scheduling and building API workflows, there are a few properties that you would look at. I'm just going to include some text here in this deck so that you can refer to it at a later point. But let's just get started with our app. So I'm going to pull up my test app that I have ready. And then this is the editor view that you're all familiar with. And then let us preview in run mode. So this is just a input form where you can create an event, and here are a few events that I have. So for example, if I'm creating an event, let's say cooking class, and I'm going to schedule that for tomorrow at a certain time, and then learn cooking, and I say create, you can see that appear right here. Now, say I want to send a reminder to users about this cooking class that is going to be scheduled for tomorrow, but I want to send them a reminder one day before. The way you will do is through an API workflow. So we want this update button to go to the cooking classes page, and then we want to schedule a reminder just for that cooking class. This button currently does nothing, and so that is our first example to make it send an email reminder to users. So let's head back into the editor, and I will pull up the event schedule page. And let us click on this button, schedule reminder. And it currently has nothing. So what we want to do is actually go to custom events and say schedule API workflow on a list. And there are a lot of inputs right here. And before we even start doing that, the first thing that we need to do to be able to run an API workflow is to go to settings, go to API, and then expose a workflow API. And when you do that, you will see this tab appear right here called API workflows. So we're going to create a new API endpoint, and let's call that reminder email. And we have 4 issues here because it's saying that you got to fill out a bunch of details, and we'll fill that out in a bit. So the first thing we want to do is we want to define parameters, like what do we need for this reminder email. And back in our deck, you can see that we will need something called an event and a user parameter, because these are the 2 things that we actually care about for sending this reminder to users. So back in here, let us add something called event, and let us call this user. And for event, let us make this an event type. And for user, let us make this a user type. So just as a reminder for the database side of these things, you can go to the database right here, and you can see there are 2 custom data types. So user is always a predefined data type in Bubble, but event is something that I created with a bunch of fields that I'm interested in tracking for an event, like for a cooking class. It had a name, description, and a few other items. So back in our workflows, once we have specified these parameters, before we get into that, there are 2 ways to define a parameter. One is like a manual definition, and another is a detect request data. So the manual definition is something that you specify on your own, whereas a detect request data is something where you just like send a bunch of data to Bubble, and Bubble tries to figure out like how it's structured. But for our example, let's just keep it simple and keep it as event and user, something that's defined manually. And then for the reminder email, what we want to do is add an action that actually sends that email. So let us go to email and add send email. And then when you click on these different inputs, you'll see something very interesting. So if I click insert dynamic data, I now can select user and user's email. So just because we defined what a user is and we pass that as a parameter, we can now access that parameter data type and the fields associated with that data type. And so for the sender's name, we're going to say user's name. And then for subject, we can just say reminder email. And for that, we can choose event name. And then for a body, we can say hi user's name. Please join us for event's name that is scheduled on. And here I can access the event's start date. So this email is using dynamic values. And we can also say thanks from the team. So this just generates an email, but we want to actually trigger this action. And the way you trigger this action is you go back to your page, event schedule page, and currently where the button schedule has an empty schedule API workflows on a list, we're going to start filling it out. So for the API workflow, we're going to choose reminder email. That's the one that we just created. And for the type of things that we want is actually user. You would think like it could be events too, but what we have multiples of is multiple users for this one cooking event. And so the list to run on is you can do a simple do a search for users, because we're going to send this for all users. Let's assume they all want to join this cooking class. But then, just like you guys are used to like adding constraints and filters for, typical searches on your page, you can do that here too, to like pass a customized list of people who want to attend this event. And then for schedule date, this is where it gets really fun and shows like one of the main advantages of API workflows is that you can choose schedule date, current page events, start date, and then dynamically choose what do you want to do with that start date. So we know that we want to send a reminder one day before the start date of the current page event. So now you can select plus days and just add a -1. If this was like a different kind of event where you're sending a follow-up to an event, you could like add a few days after, you could add a few hours after. It's totally up to you. And then for interval, this is something that is very useful for like large scale operations. Say your list was like thousands of people long. and you have a complex workflow that is executing for each person on this list, you want to leave a little gap in between. You don't want to like run 10,000, 100,000 workflows all in like a few seconds. So like kind of space it out just to maintain system stability. So we recommend 3 to 5 seconds. So I'm just going to say 3 seconds right here. And then you can see that the parameters that we defined back in the API workflows tab for a reminder email where we had event and user, that should be available in events schedule right here. And you can say which event. So the event that we want is current page event, because when we clicked on the button for the cooking class, which took us to this page specifically for cooking class, we want to like send a reminder only for this cooking class and not for other kinds of events. So it is a current page event. And for users, we want to like send each user an individualized email. So we're going to say this user. Now, this user, this part of this user is a very interesting concept, because that means that you have a list of users. Say we have 5 users, so user 1, user 2, user 3, and so on. It's going to go through each user. So for user 1 specifically, it's going to send them an email. Then for user 2, it's going to send them another email. And so this allows you to like go through each item in the list and do something unique for those users. So if you have a more complex workflow where different users are getting slightly different values, you can customize that using parameters. So we're going to say this user. And then once we have set this up, we're pretty much good. We're just going to add one more thing potentially, which can help us keep track of what we just sent. So let us do data make change to a thing. And for the thing, we can say current page event. And for current page event, we have created a field called reminder workflow ID. You could call it whatever you want. And this is kind of like a more advanced concept, but useful for tracking things, a few days later, a few months later, when you want to realize what you scheduled, if it's yet to happen, but you want to keep track of all the things you've scheduled for a particular event. And then you can now say add list and refer dynamically to result of step 1. So what this is going to do is it's going to schedule a bunch of workflows for this event, and then it's going to track the workflows that have been scheduled for that event and add it to this list field for this event. So we're going to see this in practice. I'm just going to reload the page and test. Anything so far? Did I lose you guys, or any questions before we test? Okay, so let us test this. And I'm going to say schedule a reminder. And so I just added some conditional formatting to tell us that, hey, I've scheduled a reminder for this. And then let us go to logs and then go to scheduler. And then you'll see this view right here. Click on show. And then it says reminder email. That is what we just scheduled for the cooking class. And you will see that there are 3 lines right here. And that is because it's a little cut off right here. But the point is that each of these lines represent a different user from the list. So if you have 5 users, you're going to see 5 lines because there are 5 items in the list that you're running on. And each workflow run represents 1 item on the list. And these can execute in parallel. So that kind of like saves you so much time. And like that's like one of the core functions of API workflows, which is to save you time, automate like very tedious tasks while giving a very customized view to your audience. And so you can run very highly interactive activities for people. And so, we have a few test users in our database. So these guys should receive an email 24 hours or like 1 day before the event. And so if I look at the events for the cooking class that we just created, you'll also see this reminder workflow ID 28, 29, 30. And so if I compare it against the scheduler right here, that is this workflow ID. This is useful if you for example, ran a workflow on a 1,000-item list and you want to cancel some of these because you realize some people canceled and they shouldn't be receiving follow-up emails for something. You can always refer to the reminder workflow ID list field and then cancel those specific items. And say, for example, you want to cancel or pause all the scheduled workflows, because like there's just too much stress in your system, or you just want to debug something before you like send a whole bunch of emails, just click pause tasks and it'll pause for you. And then when you're ready to like resume tasks, click resume tasks. So this is a really powerful feature, and it's a lot of fun to play with, and there are a lot of ways to kind of track things and kind of audit and kind of pause things if you need to do for this extremely powerful functionality. So this is basically the first example, which is quite easy and fun to like schedule an event in the future. So the next part is actually scheduling things multiple times in the future. So we're looking at something called recurring events. It's very similar to how you will schedule an API workflow. But the benefit of this is, for example, that you have financial reports that you send to your clients, or invoices that you send to your clients every week or month or quarter. You can like have a report automatically generated and delivered to their inbox every week or quarter. So let us head on to another page called recurring. And so the example that we will use right here for the recurring test is to generate and deliver a monthly newsletter automatically to users. You could like use plugins to like generate visualization, like charts, convert it into a PDF and then send that as part of an email. There's like a lot that you can do, but we're just using like a narrow example to discuss recurring workflows. And what we will do is, let's preview this. So I had the logic set up to like send a newsletter to the current user. So let me actually run it as a user so it looks more realistic. Okay, so I'm running as Matt, and I haven't yet subscribed to this awesome monthly newsletter. If I click this button, it currently does nothing. But let us subscribe Matt for this monthly newsletter so that he gets a newsletter, March, the next month, and every month for the next year. Until you cancel that recurring workflow. And so let us go to API workflows again. And this time, instead of a new API endpoint, we're going to create a new recurring event. And let us call this monthly newsletter. And the type of thing is user. And we're going to have this as a simple email. But again, like I said, you could generate reports and attach like a file to this email or trigger some other kind of events. Totally up to you. So we're going to say this is the current workflow user's email. And then for sender's name, current workflow user's name. Subject, we can say that is newsletter. And then here you can access the usual like dynamic fields that you can do elsewhere, where you can say do a search for, and I can say events, and I can choose the first item. And so basically, if you were sending a newsletter for like the next 5 events scheduled, as a sneak peek for events scheduled next month, like you can constrain your search in a way that only shows those events, and then say event. Okay, so like the setup for recurring events is quite simple compared to like scheduled API workflows. But we have one more step to actually determine the frequency of when we will send this monthly newsletter to Matt. So let's go back to the recurring page. And then for the button subscribe, let us go to custom events and say set cancel a recurring event. And then for the recurring event, now monthly newsletter shows up. So let's add monthly newsletter. And the workflow thing is the current user, because we want Matt to be subscribed to the monthly newsletter when he clicks that button. And for frequency, there are a bunch of options. Like this varies by plan. So for this test app, I've set it to a personal plan. So I'm going to say this is for monthly. And then for a start date, again, you can choose whichever date you want. You can pass the date, through a datetime picker, through a database value. I'm just going to say this is current date and time. So I'm going to subscribe him to a monthly newsletter starting today. And then we're pretty much set, and let us test. Okay, so let me click subscribe. And did that do something? Let me double check. Nothing yet. Let me see what I did. Oh, right here. So we have our monthly newsletter triggered for April 15th. And it is going to Matt. Let me make sure it's Matt. Yes. I should have named these emails more logically. But yes, you can see your monthly newsletter will be delivered to Matt on April 15th. And it looks pretty much like any scheduled API workflows, but you have your date, you have your workflow ID, and you have what kind of API event it is with the associated thing. So the thing will be the unique ID of the item that you're running on. So in this case, it's the user. So that shows an example of recurring events. And just to reiterate, we used a very simple example right here for monthly newsletter. We're sending emails, but like you can have a plugin action that is right for the send email action, and then dynamically refer to whatever the result of that plugin action is, and refer to that in your email. It could be like a link to a file or a report or anything else that you prefer. So before we head into our next example, any questions so far? So we have a few questions, and I'll go through it. So the first question is the tool free and available for us to educate ourselves later? Of course. So Bubble has a hobby plan, but API workflows are available on paid plans. What is workflow folder option in the recurring event scheduler? That's a question by Sanas. So the workflow folder option is a way for you to just like organize your workflows. So for like really complex apps, you might want to just like create folders, like you create folders in your inbox to like sort emails and stuff. And then another question from Crawford: how do you schedule an API workflow or recurring event without requiring the user to click something? So we're going to get to that as our last example. Can you edit the date for the delivery? Absolutely. So for our monthly newsletter, we just defined the action right here, but like where you are actually scheduling this recurring event. So on this page where button subscribe is clicked, where you have the start date, you can change the start date to whatever you want, and that'll change when you want this to run. How does the privacy checkbox work? You can, so privacy checkbox, is that for the, let's head back right here. Are you referring to ignore privacy rules when running the workflow? So since these are server-side actions, we're a little more comfortable with like using data that is not exposed to the user to like perform some calculation and present values that we are comfortable sharing with the user. Whereas like if you are displaying the data on the page, so you're doing like a regular action, on the client, all the data is exposed to the user. Whereas here, since everything's done on the server, you can theoretically ignore privacy rules while running the workflow, and then taking the result and then presenting that to the user. And then another question: can we set a specific time for recurring events instead of hourly, monthly? So those are the standard options for recurring workflows, but you can use like your regular schedule API workflows to run it at a specific time that you want. Okay, So let me head into our last example, which is a more complex example. And I'll walk you through the main concept. So at a high level, what you can do in with API workflows is basically trigger something in your app from an external service. So a standard flow for this, or a use case for this, would look like, you have a bunch of subscribers in your app, and you want to charge the subscriber a customer. So you send information about a customer to Stripe, which is a payment gateway. You can use whichever payment gateway you like. And they charge that customer's credit card. And then they send a confirmation back to your app so that you know the customer's charge went through. So then you can deliver services to your customer. So where Stripe is sending information back to your app, which then does something, that is the part where like webhooks come into play. And that's where like defining an endpoint that is exposed either to the public or like is exposed to a particular external service to do something in your app automatically without the user doing anything. That is where one of the most powerful features of an API workflow comes into play. So the endpoint will look something like this. It's actually very similar to the endpoints that you just created, and I'm going to walk you through an example of how we will use this. So since using the Stripe example will be a bit complicated for this session, because like we'll have to come up with test credit cards and stuff like that, we're going to use this service called Postman to show how to trigger an endpoint in your app to then automatically run workflows. So let's imagine Postman is actually this external service. It is an external service hitting your app, which does something in your app. And no user interaction is required for this. This just happens automatically. So let us go to our test app and our workflows tab. And then I'm going to create something called something that changes a date. So for example, say I have an external service that manages events for me, and I'm kind of a ticketing platform, and I want to change some information in my database so that I can send updated tickets to users, for example. In that situation, what we want to do is modify this type, events type, and I want to change the start date of an event. So where I have like football scheduled for March 18th, I want to change that to say March 19th. So I'm going to set up an endpoint where an external events service can trigger a change in my app to update the start date without a user doing anything. So it's just like this external service talking to our app automatically. So let us go to workflows, and I'm going to say new API endpoint. And let's call this change date. And then for this, we need a few parameters. So let us call this event, which event we want to change. And let's select event. And the field that we want to change is the start date. So let us call this new date. And let's select date type. And you'll see why we're doing this. And so the action that we want triggered if we hit this endpoint in our app is to make changes to a thing. And the thing in this case is the event. And the field that we want to change is the start date. And we want to update that start date field to the new date. And the way we will hit this endpoint is, actually before we get there, we have not checked this box where it says this end can be run without authentication. That means we require authentication. So the example that I'll walk you through will include authentication. And you get that information from going to your settings API, and I generated a API token label change date with this private key. You can generate more keys if you like, or regenerate this key. And then hand out these keys to different services that you want to authorize to be able to trigger something within your app. So it says, this is kind of like a pass saying like, hey, go ahead, send me some information. I'm going to do it in my app. So let us pull up Postman. I'm going to share that with you. All right, can you guys see this new screen? Great. Okay, so in this new screen, this is a service called Postman, and you can download this for Windows or Mac, whatever you prefer. And then it looks like this. It looks slightly different while you're setting it up, but like this is kind of where all the magic happens. And one cool part about Postman is you can use this for debugging other API calls. So like if some of you attended the API connector webinar, like a lot of the debugging that you'll do with other services can be done in Postman as well to just kind of get like an extra data point of what works and what doesn't work. So here we are going to select post. You will always post to a bubble endpoint at the moment, though other services are sometimes more flexible and allows you to get as well. So for post, we're going to enter that specific endpoint's URL. And the way you get that is in a very specific format. So from our webinar deck, let me just pull that up. This is the format where you have app name.bubbleapps.io. It could be a custom domain as well. Version test only fits the version test. And then you have API /1.1/workflows/endpoint name. And so we're going to replace this endpoint name with what we had in our app, and that was called change date. So I'm going to say change date, and I'm going to replace the app name to my test app's name, which is called API Cafe. And then we're going to add a few more details in here. So the first thing we want to do is authorization. Since we require authentication as a type, you're going to choose bearer token. And so this bearer token is exactly what I generated from my app editor settings in the API tab. And then for the body, we can pass in the two parameters that we defined. So there's like a small distinction that I'll get to in a bit. But just for like doing one example first, let us enter our first parameter, which was called event. And let us enter another one, which was called new date. And then for event, we're going to identify an event with a unique ID of that event. So we want to change the football events details. So I'm just going to copy the football events unique ID and paste that in here. And then for new date, I want to enter a new date. So previously, the football event was scheduled to start on March 18th at 4:30, but I want to change the date. I want to make this March 19th. And then we're almost set. Let us test. I get status success. That means it says this is successful. Let me head back to my app. I'm going to switch my screen back to the app. Okay, so at the moment it shows March 18th. Let me refresh data for our football tryouts. March 19th. So our changes were automatically triggered as soon as I hit the endpoint, which was defined right here for change date. It made change to the exact event that we passed to the parameter, and it updated the field for that event start date to the new date that we passed through that parameter. So this is an example of something super powerful because it allows you to kind of just hit an endpoint and do stuff in your app. And this can be, you can actually do something more dynamic where you're identifying the event not just by the unique ID, but through some other kind of constraint that, multiple events that meet a certain criteria, do something to them. And then there's one more thing where we passed the parameters in the body, but like you can also pass it as a query string. That starts getting a little more technical, but like if you enable the query string right here, you can, where you have this endpoint like URL, basically there'll be like a question mark, and then you can add the parameters right here, and then just like hit that endpoint. But like passing to the body is one approach. There are many different approaches. You guys can like check out more on this through the documentation that we will cover in a bit. Any questions so far? I'm seeing a few questions. When I go, it'll be 8 days. Can the URL API endpoint domain name be customized to something like my custom domain slash API 1.1 workflow endpoint name? Absolutely. Yes, it can work with your custom domain. That was just an example to show you. You can definitely use your custom domain. Any other questions? Can you explain the query methodology more? So is that regarding the make change action? Question from Dan De Silva. Yeah, so for that, like where you have passed a parameter where it's like key events, like for example, where I just have one event, I could make this list array, and then things to change can be like a list of events, and you can send events that meet a certain criteria. Like for example, you could do a search for events. Right here, I've made change to one thing, but I can actually make change to a list of things where I can say event. And list to change is event. So I'm actually passing like a list, and you can do it like this, where you're passing a parameter, or you can also do something like do a search for all events, and then add a constraint on that event. For example, like start date is after current date and time, something like that. It's very open-ended. Like most of the complexity or like the way to get very customized results happens in like your parameter definition. So like spend time with that, play around with a few different versions, and you can see, how that impacts the values that are available once you're actually doing the action. Because basically once you define the parameter, those are the things that you're using as ingredients in this action. And then a question about, can you send data to external apps instead of receiving? Absolutely. So you can definitely send data to external apps. Usually that is through like an API call where you'll use the API connector, or like you'll post to an external service, and that external service, like Stripe, for example, will hit an endpoint in your app to do something in your app. Is it possible to expose a GET API? So you're just exposing an endpoint, but like you can definitely expose data so that other services can get data from your app. So that is back in settings, where you can say this app exposes a data API. So that is, for example, events. Say I'm providing the data to an external service. The way I can show all the events that are displayed is very similar. So API. Oops. Hold on one sec. Interesting. Let me go to data, privacy, events, fields. So yeah, you can. I'll have to like change the privacy settings a little bit more, and you can basically expose a data API here, and then that and an external service can get from your app. Basically, it'll list out all the events that are available in your app. Question about just going through a few more questions. All right, I think we are done with our questions. And you guys, thank you for the debugging. Here you go. And here you have all our events listed. You can always count on our Bubble users to give us the right answer. So this shows us the power of our community. Thanks again. And that is the right method. So make sure to check this box as well if you're exposing a specific object, and then also check against your data privacy rules for that object. Okay. Questions regarding performance. If you plan to do a lot of API calls, are there limitations in terms of quantity of calls, intervals between calls, data received, or overall performance limitation? Yes and no. So you can definitely scale to as many calls as you require, but that is something that can be managed with your server capacity as well as your plan. So very few users actually max out, but you can definitely reach out to our team if your business requires a certain limit to be removed so that you can run high volumes of API calls. With that, I want to like head over to some of our resources, which is the manual. That is the first place to check, where there's a detailed description of API workflows and how to set up an endpoint and all the different options that are available to you. So the manual is a great place to start. And there's also the reference, where it'll talk about workflow APIs, like setting up your endpoint, and go into detail about like authentication and privacy rules. So the reference is when you want to dig in deeper and like test a few different methods. And then Postman, like this is a documentation for Postman, the service that I just described. You can download an app for Windows or Mac to your laptop. And then for more like app-specific or service-specific questions, like definitely use the forum. We have a bunch of pro users. Obviously, there are a few pro users here too who send me a great reminder. But like always check in with the community. I participate in the forum. All our team is on the forum, and we're happy to answer your questions and spread the word, share the knowledge. So do reach out to us. You can also reach out to us at support@bubble.is if you have more custom questions. With that, we will conclude the session, and yes, we'll send out an email containing a link to the video recording. And we'll also send out a little survey to get your thoughts on what would be a good topic for future webinars. Thanks again for joining. See you next time.